Hi, so this video is devoted to Krugman's model of increasing returns, monopolistic competition, and international trade. So this is the second part. If you've not seen the first part, please check it before. So to recall what we discussed last time, so based on the type of consumer preferences and to be more specific from the love of variety feature of consumer preferences, we derived PP curve. So basically it describes the relationship between price-wage ratio and elasticity, which in turn depends on output or consumption of certain good. So here it was. We derived the Z curve from zero profit condition because, as you remember, under monopolistic competition model, all the firms make zero profit in the long run perspective, and this happens due to the absence of the barriers to entry. So from zero profit condition, we derived ZZ curve, which describes the relationship between price-wage ratio, fixed cost, variable cost, the stock of labor force, and consumption. And finally, we calculated the number of goods produced in equilibrium at the function of labor force and production cost. So as you remember, here it was. And equilibrium price to wage ratio, or let's say inverted real wage, because real wage is calculated as wage divided by price, was determined by the intercept of ZZ and PP curve. So when two conditions are met at the same time. So on one hand, consumers maximize their utility from consumption. On the other hand, firms have zero profit in the long run perspective. So now, based on this, we will try to analyze implications of three possible reasons behind market increase, which are increase in the stock of labor force, international trade or openness to international trade, and migration. So let's start with increase in the stock of labor force. So if you look at this, you will see that labor force has nothing to do with PP curve. So under PP curve, price-wage ratio is not affected by the size of the labor force. However, when you look at ZZ curve, you will see that the size of the labor force actually determines the shape of the ZZ curve. So to be more precise, if we assume that L prime is bigger than L, the coefficient of 1 over C will change, and as the result, the function will kind of shift down and the slope will change accordingly. You will see this in a second. At the same time, we can see that the number of goods sold on the market will increase as well. So when it comes to implications of increase in the stock of labor force, we will discuss it in a second. But even looking at this, you can see that with bigger N, we have bigger variety of goods, which is obviously good for domestic consumers with their love of variety. So, getting back. So with the new ZZ curve, we have new equilibrium price to wage ratio. So basically price to wage ratio will be smaller under new ZZ curve, resulting from increase in the stock of labor force. So as you remember, price to wage ratio is simply inverted real wage, calculated as wage to price ratio. So with the decrease of price to wage ratio, we actually have bigger real wage. So if we assume increasing returns to scale and monopolistic competition, we see that when the stock of labor force increases, so on one hand we have bigger variety of goods, on the other hand we have bigger real wage. So actually it's radically different to what we can conclude from neoclassical model featuring constant returns to scale. So under constant returns to scale assumption, increase in the stock of labor force is associated with decrease in wages, simply because wage is calculated as marginal product of labor, and when the stock of labor increases, marginal product of labor decreases and wage accordingly. So again, even at this point, you can see how implications of Krugman's model are radically different from the implications of the neoclassical model. Okay, so talking about international trade. At this point, let us assume that we analyze two perfectly identical countries. So in these two countries, consumers have identical preferences and technologies are the same as well. And yeah, for a moment, let us also assume that two countries have the same capital labor abundance. So in this case, there is no reason to trade according to comparative advantage or Ricardian model, because you can recall that according to Ricardian model, difference in technologies is the main source of international trade, like the main determinant of international trade. Yeah, this will be more accurate. So in case production possibilities frontiers have the same shape, and this is the case when technologies are identical, there is no reason to trade according to Ricardian model. And if we assume that two countries have the same capital to labor ratio, Hackshaw all-in model will fail to predict any international trade as well. Predict or explain, let's say. So yeah, just to make a brief summary. If there are two identical countries with the same consumer preferences and identical technologies, both Ricardian and Hackshaw all-in model predict zero international trade. However, this is not the case. So if we assume that there are two symmetrical economies, again, symmetrical economies just means two economies with the same preferences and technologies. So if we assume that two symmetrical economies are open to trade at zero transportation cost, the effect of this will be just identical to the effect of increase in the size of labor force in two countries simultaneously. And if it sounds counterintuitive for you, again, we have the same technologies and we have the same preferences. So basically, openness to international trade means that both countries have more labor input in their disposal, and that's it. So analogously to the effect of increase in the stock of labor force, we expect increase in real wages and also bigger variety of products available on each market. Okay, so actually in this case, unlikely to the Hackshaw all-in and Ricardian model, the direction of trade is impossible to determine. Because as you remember, in Ricardian model, the country will export the good at which it has a comparative advantage. In case of Hackshaw all-in model, the country will export the good which uses intensively the factor of production the country is relatively abundant with. So in this case, it's not the case. We cannot determine the direction of trade. However, we can determine the volume of trade, and it will be derived from utility maximization condition. So we assume that in both countries, utility, like overall utility, can be decomposed into utility from consuming domestically produced goods and utility from consuming goods produced in the foreign country. So in this case, we assume that domestic economy will produce goods from 1 to n, and foreign economy will produce goods from n plus 1 to n star. And accordingly, the number of goods produced in each country will be just proportional to the size of the labor force. Because as you remember, we already calculated equilibrium number of goods sold on the market last time. Okay, so as I mentioned, everything will depend on the relative size of the labor force. So we assume that all goods are of the same price and expenditures on import will be proportional to the labor force size, because again last time we discussed that we assume representative worker to be the same as representative consumer. So in this case, this will stand for the overall labor income, and this will stand for the proportion of income spent on foreign goods, and altogether this is the volume of imports in the domestic economy. So analogously, you calculate the volume of imports in the foreign economy. So in other words, trade will be balanced between those two countries. So finally, we can analyze effect of migration under the assumption of this model. So as we discussed before, in contrast to the neoclassical model prediction, when in the absence of barriers to production factors movement, we assume that that the stock of capital and labor, to be more precise, capital to labor ratio will be equalized in two countries. So unlike this assumption, due to the fact that higher stock of the labor force is expected to result in the higher real wages, there will be the following tendency. So if we assume that there are two regions of the identical technologies and preferences, but one of the regions is slightly bigger, then we can immediately say that in this region real wages will be higher in comparison to the smaller region. So yeah, we discussed it as we discussed this graph in order to illustrate the effect of increase in the size of labor force, but we can just assume that ZZ prime describes ZZ curve in the bigger region, the region with the bigger labor force, and ZZ describes the relationship between price-wage ratio and elasticity in the smaller region. So in this case, in the bigger region, we will have smaller price-to-wage ratio, or in other words, higher real wage. So again, there will be a discrepancy. So the region with the bigger stock of labor force will have higher wages. And due to this discrepancy, more and more people will move from the smaller region to the bigger region, making the bigger region even more advantageous and attractive. So as a result, bigger region will become even bigger and smaller region will become even smaller. And if you need any kind of empirical example, think about city agglomerations. So people move to Warsaw because there are higher wages, bigger variety of products, and more opportunities in general. So Warsaw agglomeration becomes even bigger, and smaller regions become even smaller and less competitive. And actually, I believe this is kind of a common tendency. So yeah, this is kind of a proof, that this model is valid at least to some extent. Okay, so that's it, and thank you for watching.